Welcome back in Solitude with myself, DJ Hero. In this week's tutorial, we're going to go over how I process and mix my bassline elements. In a previous video, we went over mixing the percussion of a track, and with that done, next we're going to add the bassline and all of its parts into the mix. In today's bass music, typically you're going to have several different bass parts that sum together to complete the sound for your track. In the track that I am working on today, the sub-frequency of the bass line are going to be filled by an 808 style kick drum, so we won't be worried about the low end. If you want more on that topic, however, I do have 2 prior videos to help you dial that in. So let's dive in. First off, here's the drums, just for a reference, that we need to fit our bass line into. Right. And here's what the raw, unprocessed bass line sounds like. Now, I'm not going to get into how I made each of the bassline elements. Each of the parts were made in Serum and have had some prior processing on them, and then I bumped them down to a waveform. I like to do it this way so that I can see the actual wave. I can zoom in really close and make any edits to make sure they're all clean. There are no little artifacts, clicking sounds, or anything like that. I like to be able to go in and see that they're all sitting neatly and nicely. Maybe if I needed to requantize or whatever the case may be, I like to bounce them down to a waveform so that I can work with them in the final kind of mix down stage. But as you could have heard, they're not really mixed. They're just kind of sitting there by them, playing their individual role. And we need to fix that so that they all sit together neatly and then ultimately sit together with the drum beats that we have up here. So let's start off with the first bit. This grit bark, as I've named it, we'll solo that. It's just a little bark at the top of the bar. Now, like I said, the sub bass of the track is being fulfilled by an 808 style kick. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to add an EQ to the track. And I'm going to cut everything below 150 hertz. The reason I chose 150 hertz is because that's what I made the sub bass with. It was everything from 150 down to ultimately 20 hertz where it was shelved off. So we don't need any of the signal below 150 hertz. The kick drum and 808 sound is going to fill that part. And that's what we get. Sounds a little thin, so what I might do is kind of give us a little extra, just so I can get some of this area here. All right. Now that part's out of the way. I'm going to open up my master so that I can have this, and we can see what's going on. So clear that out. See, I've got a nice little stereo range. This is where the frequencies are sitting. I want to kind of boost this area a little bit. Here's my logic in that. I know that my hi-hats, the top end of my snare, they're all going to fill everything up here, maybe around 6,000 to 8,000 hertz and above. And I know that the body of my snare is probably somewhere in the 200, 250 range. This sound is a little thin in that low range. So maybe give that a little boost. Bring that back so you can see it. Right, this little area here. So like, what are we looking at? 385, 386. Give that a boost. Just gives it a little more body. Yeah. And then it's kind of got a little peak in here. This around the set, what's that? About 730. So 730. Slender that down, bring that down. Just kind of balancing out the sound a little bit. That's all I'm kind of doing here, is just trying to give it a little more balance. Right. Okay. And then we'll leave that sound for now. Moving on to the next, this metal bark. I'm going to add it to the mix, both sounds together so that I can hear them. The idea being I want them both to be balanced as far as my ear hears them. I don't want one to be louder than the other. Let's see what we've got. So first thing I can tell is that that metal bark that we're now working on is louder than the gritty bark. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add that EQ back. We're going to do the same thing here. And make sure that it's fairly well balanced. Yeah, this is pretty good. Little peak. And you notice that once I clip that 150 hertz below, it clean. So let's turn that down. We'll bring that down about 3 decibels just to give us a little working room here. But what I want to do is bring this, what is that, about 775 area. 775. I want to bring that down a little bit. There we go. And then I'll bring the bark back in. Let's shorten that up. I'm just going to shorten this so that I can just hear the two. Mute that for a second so I can see this again. All right, let's add that back. It's a little loud, so I'm going to turn it down. Maybe I'm going to start at about 3 decibels. Too much. So about 2 decibels. You can see here. A little more. That's good. That's good. Now they're kind of riding in a similar area, right? As far as the volume of them go. All right, cool. Let's move on to this growl here. I'll shorten this so we skip straight to it. And again, we don't need the low end, so I'm going to drop my EQ on here. Knock that out really quick. I'm going to bring this down just a couple of decibels to give us a little room to work. It's a fairly well-balanced sound to begin with. No spiking frequency ranges. But let's hear it in comparison to, say, this sound. Seems to be a little quiet. So rather than turn the growl sound up, I'm going to turn both the metal bark and the grit down to fit. That's good. Right in there. Good. All right. Now moving on to the rhythm portion of this bass line. Back that up. Again, according to my meter here, fairly well balanced sound. one little kind of spiking area here. So let's take a look. We'll add our EQ. Cut it like so. Now this little peak is at what? About 700 hertz. So I'm going to add a spot on the EQ and bring it down and really kind of bring the notch in there. So we're focusing solely on that little spike. There we go. Kind of tame that peak just a little bit. And now let's add in the other sounds. So this final calling sound is just a little bit louder, so let's turn it down in the mix. Let's give it a good listen. I'm going to clear my meter here so I can see all of them together. Now, I am a huge proponent of using a meter as well as my ears. The reason being is you don't know if your room is perfect, and I know it's probably not. I myself am technically a bedroom producer. I have my second bedroom in my home set up as my studio, and it is pretty well treated with respect to the sound treatment, bass traps, and materials to deaden the sound itself in the room. But it's not perfect. And I can't trust my ears 100%. Even after 20 some odd years, my ears are fairly well trained, but I like to have that extra step, right? We've got all these tools. I might as well use them all and not rely on just human error, the human element, which is prone to human error. So I'll use metering quite a bit for a couple of reasons. One, I can see where things are peaking at, what frequencies kind of stand out. I can see the width. I can see phasing issues on the sounds. This one, as far as the mix goes, let's hear this. Okay, now let's add this metal part. Those two are good. Let's add this part. It's a little loud still. Now let's add this part. I think we're good as far as all of them being balanced well. Now you'll notice I didn't add any distortions or saturations or compressors. All I really did on each of these channels is add my EQ to help me shape the sounds a little bit relative to the sounds that are all playing together. Once I've done that, I'll grab all the bass sounds, create a group, and we'll call this the bass bus, right? Now they're all going to this one channel. This is where I will start to do a little extra processing to kind of really glue them all together and really make them one cohesive sound. So working just on the bus, we can kind of minimize these to save some space. I'm here, solo that. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to make the decision, do we do additional EQing to kind of touch them all together? I like to start with compression, and I like to use, on my bass lines especially, the multiband OTT for my style of music. It's a great choice. Now, don't know that I would go with the OTT if I was making house music or techno or, more deeper soulful music that has or requires more space, but we're making sort of obnoxious bass music, so let's stick with the obnoxious over-the-top tool. I'm going to kind of turn the amount down to 0 and give it a listen. Watching my metering here. Pretty well balanced. So let's start adding in now, as you add the amount to the OTT, as you increase the amount, you're going to start hearing the OTT work. You're going to hear that sizzliness that the OTT tends to add to frequencies that are a little lower in the mix. I mean, that's what it's doing, is it's basically squeezing that sound and bringing out the quieter elements, bringing them more to the front. It is over the top and aptly named so. But that's what I kind of want. Now, if we were to turn the time here all the way counterclockwise, you'll really hear that squeezed, crushed sound like this. You'll hear that the first grit bark here, or not grit bark, the metal bark, really gets a little mungy, gets really dirty and crushed. A little too much for my taste. Now, if we turn this all the way to the other side, everything's going to get really clean and really snappy. So what we want to do is find that happy medium in between. Feeling it right in there. Just enough of the more subtle frequencies bring to the top, or brought to the top, but without really kind of making a mess of the sounds themselves. And looking at the metering, pretty good. The next step, I'm immediately going to create a group so that I have a chain, and we'll call this one the main. In a moment here, I'm going to create a second chain to add a little extra depth to the sound, but let's stick with the main sound right now. The next step, I'm going to add some saturation, and I'm just going to stick with the Ableton saturator. I'm going to dial up my digital clip. We'll start with the analog clip. I'm going to bring that back. We're going to really drive it up just a bit to 6 decibels to start, and hear what this sounds like. If I push the drive, you'll hear it start to get distorted quickly. Which, not what I want to go for. So I'm actually going to go with the sine fold, and I'll start with what I was at, 6 decibels, and mix in the wet until I hear the tones start to warm up. Yeah, that's right about in there. And now I'm going to turn it down, because you can see we've driven that quite a bit. And I'm going to turn it down the same decibels that I pushed the drive, 6 dB. This is just kind of a starting point. Looking good. Good. And now I'm going to add an EQ to the end of that chain, because adding all that additional compression and that saturation is going to bring back some of that frequency range that we've intentionally cut out. But if you recall, on the grit bark, I left a little space, so I'm not going to make it 150. I'm going to make it about 100. And then from here, what I want to do is now start to carve the bass line in a subtle way, not in a heavy-duty way, not in a heavy-handed way, carve the bass line so that it fits into our drums. If you look at the bass sound by itself now, it's pretty well balanced. Probably a little bit in the 750 range I could bring down. Let's do that before we move forward. Bring that down. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Okay. So then the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to bring in the percussion, only I'm going to, for the time being, only the hi-hats, claps, snares. I'm going to leave the kick drum out of it. So let's bring that back. Solo my percussion. You notice the kick drum is off, just so that I can now start to balance those two elements. And right now you hear the bass line is well overpowering in relation to the drums themselves. So let's bring it down quite a bit. We'll start low. Okay, we're working okay here. I'm going to move over to the next section because the hi-hats and the shakers are there, just to give those a listen as well. Now, what I want to do from here is really start to dial in the bass line. The drums are the way I want them to be. We did that mix earlier. We got those frequencies really settled up how we wanted them. So what's next is to kind of carve the bass line into its own spot. And to do that, I'll bring up the EQ here. And we know that the open hats, the closed hats, the shakers, and the kind of the top end of that's the snare clap combination, they're really going to fill that higher end range. Now let's listen just to see it here. Up here, right? Really up, right around, 4,000 is where that really picked up. If I were to leave the snare and clap out of it, right? That's this area here. Bring the snare. I'll bring the clap down a little. There we go. So we want to save a little space over here on the bass line. One way we could do it is we could go to add a little notch, about 4,000 hertz, and make it a shelf. Right, we can do it that way, which is how we're going to do it. I'm going to bring the bass line back in. Again, we're not doing it heavy-handed. We don't want to take away the fidelity or the life of our bass line, but we're going to create a little space. And I'm actually going to bring this down a bit too. Now let's go back to the snare so you can see this. See this peak here? This is the body of the snare. It's right about 217 hertz, right? So on our bass line, I'm going to add a spot, 217 hertz, notch it down a bit, and I'm going to make room for the body of that snare so that it stands out. Now, one thing that I think a lot of people might overlook, and it's great to have the tool, the Ableton EQ is capable of doing it, the Fab Filter, if you don't have an EQ that's capable of doing what we're about to do next, find one that works. The Ableton one is great. Like I said in the past videos, I love my Fab Filter plugins, but I know that the snare, if we go back to the snare itself, is pretty well mono, right? So I go back to my bass line. I'm going to do an extra deep cut in that same range, only I'm going to do it just in the mid-range. Just the mono even this scoop here, I think we're going to make that mono as well. If I bring that down a lot, you'll hear the width kind of stand out in the bass line, which clears up a lot of overhead for the snare. Now, that's a little extreme, so I dig it. Now let's bring the percussion back, bass line in. Good deal. So it just kind of shaped that bass line a bit with the EQ. To kind of quickly recap, first thing I did, I added the OTT, kind of configured that how I felt it brought out the harmonics and the more subtle frequencies, kind of balanced the sound out a bit. Then I added some saturation, kind of warmed up the sound, added a little just harmony, just those bringing some of those frequencies and making them a bit more harmonic, and then used the EQ to shape the sound a bit more so that it sits better with the percussion. Now, when I'm producing the sounds, the individual sounds, these 4 sounds here, in my VST or in my hardware, whatever the case may be, I am not afraid to use onboard effects to that synth. I don't like to use onboard reverb. The reason why is I like all of my parts to kind of share the same reverb space. So this is why I created a chain, this audio effects rack. I'll create another chain, and we'll call this one reverb. And I'm going to add just an Ableton reverb. The preset I'm going to drop, if you're an Ableton user, is going to be Empty Club. And then we'll make a few adjustments to it. We're going to leave it at 100% wet, and we're going to mute the main for now. 100% wet. I'm going to shorten the decay time for now, and I'm going to shorten the pre-delay to about 5, just to give the attack of those sounds a little bit of space. And let's listen. Let's mute the drums for now. Good stereo. Maybe carve some of the color here. There we go. Perfect. So now let's add the main back in and then kind of adjust the levels of the reverb so that it just a little bit of depth to the sound. Now that's with it. You'll see that I just turned the main sound down a little bit to give life to the reverb a smidge. So let's hear it without the reverb. And now with it. I could add a little more decay time to hear kind of just a little more of that gentle kind of wash. That might be a little much. Okay, so without it. With it. Turn this up a little more. Still think it's a little too much reverb, so let's bring it down. Right, what my goal is here is to get the reverb to be texture, not something that's in front of the sound or something that you ultimately focus on. I just want it to be texture in the mix. I like it. Right there. And then once I've got that kind of set the way I want it, I'm going to add an EQ after the reverb in the chain, and I'm going to kind of shape it a little bit more, right? It's fulfilling the role I want within this range here, so I'm going to kind of slope that a bit. And then I don't need this up here because that's going to get in the way of our drums, so I'm going to bring that down. Make a little adjustment. Okay, I like it. Now let's bring the drums back in. Turn it up a little in the mix. Now, when I'm mixing the bass parts and the drums together, what I want is to be able to hear both the percussion and the bass parts at the same relative level. Not absolute level, relative level. I don't want to have to kind of make that conscious choice as to what sound I'm listening to. I kind of want to be able to go, okay, I'm naturally hearing the drums and I'm naturally hearing the bass line at the same relative level, as opposed to, okay, I hear the drums, now let me switch my brain to hear the bass. If you're doing that, it might be a sign that your bass is too low in the mix. Or similarly, if I'm hearing the bass line, oh gosh, the snare's a little lost. Don't instantly go, I'm going to turn the snare up. Go, what part of the bass line is getting in the way of the snare? So it's like carve out the pieces, set the relative volumes so that you hear both the percussion and the bass line relatively the same. So with relative similar ease, right? Oh, I don't have to fight to hear either one. They're all there. Right? Now in this mix, that snare, it does sound a little bit in the background. So a little trick that we can do to help out here is we can grab the X for LFO tool. And I actually have a preset, but I'll make it from scratch here. Now you can do this with a side chain as well. You can use a compressor, the Ableton compressor, and create a side chain. But I'm going to do it with the LFO tool because I like the control it gives me. I'm going to set the rate to 1 bar. I'm going to bring these all the way up. And I know that my snare hits here. Bring that like that, like that. Same applies over here. And that may be a little stout, a little too deep of a cut. But what I've basically done is I've created a side chain for the bass line around the snare, which will give the snare a bit more room to breathe. So if we mute the bass line, right? Bring the bass line back. And if I make it really extreme, doesn't have to be that much. Now, there's no drums here, so you hear the side chain working in that section. That's a pretty easy fix. I'm going to take my depth, create an automation lane here on that. Perfect. Dig it? All right, now let's bring the kick in and see how that works. all sounding pretty good. Now, I do feel that the bass line has gotten a little dull in that there's not a whole lot of high end. So I'm going to add, even after the fact, an EQ after the chain. Again, cut that high off, bring that back up to 100. And I'm just going to add a little on the outside. I'm going to add a shelf. I'm going to make it just the sides. Turn it down a little bit. Still feel like the snare's having a little trouble, so I'm going to go back and add another marker, the same area where that snare is, give a little extra duck. Now, just to kind of confirm where that was, so I get the exact, I'm going to go back to this one really quick. So we were at 217. All right, so let's make that 217. And I don't want to do it so much that it starts to impact the bass line. So, I'll always start kind of heavy-handed. Okay, that's too much, obviously, but I can make adjustments from there. Okay, I dig it. I like it. And if we just let it play. And that's that. So just kind of recap what I've done here is I've gone through each of the individual bass parts and cut off the frequencies I don't need. Now, if this tune wasn't driven by an 808 kick, if I needed the actual sub-frequencies of each of these sounds, I might have done things differently. I'd have maybe a separate track that's a sine wave doing the bass portion of it, or we'd do some extra clever bits to get the sub working from individual pieces all summed together into one part. But in this song, the sub bass is being handled by the 808. So the first step was to cut out the frequencies that I don't want in the sound. So anything below, in most cases, the 150 hertz line or 100 hertz, whatever is most effective for your sound. And then when we start to add each individual piece in, we do a little bit of leveling to make sure that one piece is balanced to the next, that piece is balanced to the one after that, and so on, kind of cross-checking each of the multitude of sounds to make sure that they're all balanced, using our EQ to shape the sound wherever that sound needs to be shaped in order to best fit it into the mix. Some sounds you'll find are pretty natural and fit just as is. Some sounds you may have to do some carving. I feel a lot of that process you'll get in the actual processing of the synth itself when you're originally making it. Like I said, we're working with the waveforms here. We're at the end of the production stage of our track, so we're really just focusing on the mixing and the balancing of the sounds so that they're all cohesive and kind of sit together. And create that ultimate flow and rhythm and mix down and make sure everything is clear that we want in our final product. If you have any additional questions on the process, or you feel I've missed something, overlooked something, or didn't explain something clearly enough, please leave us a comment down in the comment section below. I'll respond to as many as I can. If you want more from me, DJ Hero, search Original DJ Hero, all one word, on Facebook, SoundCloud, Mixcloud. You can search DJ Hero on Beatport. You'll find me. Instagram, Twitter, all the same, Original DJ Hero. Give us a like, share, subscribe. Good luck on your projects, and we'll see you next time.